Snow muffles the forest. The birch trunks look like bones. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a road sinks into a black marsh that swallows boots and wheels with the same indifferent pull. A Red Army runner staggers forward, holding a message tube above his head to keep it dry. The date on his order will say 1942. The place name is Rzhev. In the long arc of the Eastern Front, Rzhev is a word spoken quietly. It lies roughly 150 miles northwest of Moscow, on the Volga's upper reaches. A modest town that, for nearly 16 months, became one of the most lethal corners of the war. Soviet soldiers would remember it as the meat grinder. German veterans, holding the salient that jutted toward Moscow, called it the Rzhev balcony. Between winter 1942 and spring 1943, armies collided here again and again. Western Front and Kalinin Front on the Soviet side. Army Group Center's 9th Army on the German side. Millions were pulled into this fight. Hundreds of thousands never came home. This is a story about what happened to some of the Soviet formations that vanished in that fighting. Divisions whose numbers were erased from rosters, whose paper trails went dark, and whose graves dissolved into peat and snow. It is also a story about why their records were sealed, and why, for decades, the fullest account of their fate remained hidden in archives that did not open until the 1990s. We begin with the map. After the failure of the German advance on Moscow in late 1941, the front stabilized in a broken crescent west of the Soviet capital. The Germans dug in, and their 9th Army held a salient around Rzhev, Sychevka, and Vyazma. From that wedge, the Wehrmacht threatened Moscow. The Red Army could not ignore it. If the salient remained, the road and rail arteries feeding Moscow would stay within German artillery reach. If it was eliminated, the Red Army would unhinge the center of the German line. Through the first months of 1942, the Soviets attacked across forests, frozen rivers, and swamps. These offensives were brutally difficult to coordinate. The frontier was broken by ravines and marshland. The roads were few and primitive. Radio nets faltered in snowstorms, and horse-drawn columns moved slowly under fire. The units often began their attacks with strong intentions and thin reserves, and then bled away in the woods, miles from their start lines. The phrase that appears in many wartime Soviet papers is clinical: disbanded due to losses. Sometimes a division that had dwindled to a few hundred effectives was merged into another. Sometimes a unit, smashed and scattered, was removed from the order of battle, and later reformed in the rear with a new draft of men. In this administrative language, there is a quiet, blunt acknowledgement. The division that existed on paper yesterday no longer exists today. For the families of its soldiers, the paperwork might lag for months or years. Missing in action, presumed dead, disappeared. One of the earliest, stark examples came in the winter fighting after the Soviet counteroffensive of 1941–42. As Soviet forces pressed west toward Vyazma and the southern shoulder of the salient, formations became overextended. In the swamps around Sychevka, rifle divisions of the Western Front suffered catastrophic losses. In some cases, regiments were cut off in islands of forest and marsh, supplied sporadically by air, fighting until ammunition and strength evaporated. When German counterattacks closed the corridors, those pockets were swallowed. In the after-action summaries, the Red Army recorded the hard fact: division headquarters destroyed, remnants absorbed by neighboring formations. The meaning, less visible, was that thousands simply did not return. By mid-1942, the German Ninth Army launched its own elimination operations against Soviet salients that had formed within the larger Rzhev bulge. These were encirclement battles in heavy woods, tight, close-range actions that left few survivors. When these battles ended, the front line might shift only a few kilometers, but the ledger of units changed abruptly. A rifle division that had been present on one week's map was gone on the next. Its reappearance later, under the same number, did not mean continuity, only a new formation built around a name with a history that, in that sector, had just been obliterated. To understand why so much of this remained obscure for so long, we have to consider the way wartime Soviet record-keeping worked and the political sensitivities that tended to follow defeat. The Red Army collected an immense amount of documentation: daily strength reports, casualty returns, operational orders, signals logs, and field journals. These were routed upward, filed by staff sections, and often copied by political departments. Three things complicated the historical record. First, the very chaos of the fighting at Rzhev meant that paperwork was often interrupted by destruction. Staff vans and field depots were shelled and burned. The files that did survive might represent a skewed picture: some corps' records preserved, others lost entirely. Second, the official narrative emphasized operations that could be celebrated: victories, turning points, liberations. The costly failures around Rzhev, particularly in the second half of 1942, did not easily fit that narrative. They were recorded, of course, but their broader analysis was classified. Third, the names associated with these operations, senior commanders, planners, and staff officers, were politically sensitive during and after the war. Some rose to the very heights of national leadership. Discussing their failures was not encouraged. The most intense phase of the Rzhev fighting began in late summer 1942 and reached a grim crescendo in November and December. In that period, the Soviets launched sequential offensives designed to crush the salient from multiple directions. The Western Front and the Kalinin Front coordinated the blows. The aim was operational encirclement: pin and cut the Ninth Army, force a collapse, and open a path west. This was a big idea, and the price would be big as well. The terrain made that price steeper. The Volga's upper basin here is a maze of small rivers: the Vezuza, Gzhat, Osuga, and dozens of streams, cutting through dense conifer and leafless birch. The ground underfoot in November is a mixture of early snow and underlying bog. Tanks bog down quickly when they leave the few roads. Infantry wade in ice water through tussock and reed. Artillery must be dragged into position along causeways visible to enemy spotters, and the Germans, sitting on gently higher ground, had the advantage of interior communications. They shifted reserves along forest tracks and struck Soviet flanks with counterattacks while the assaults were still forming. As the attacks ground forward in November 1942, Soviet rifle divisions were committed and recommitted. A division that began the month at 9,000 men might be down to a fraction of that by the first week of December. Machine gun nests that had been reported and bypassed became fatal when ammunition resupply failed and the flanks stalled. Communications lines, thin copper wire run by field telephone teams snapped under shell fire again and again, forcing runners to take to the bog with message tubes. For many formations, there is a documentary cliff in this period. The daily strength tables change from ink to pencil, from full pages to half pages, and then to a few scrawled lines. Then the trail ends. For decades after the war, this offensive remained less discussed than others happening simultaneously. There was another great battle unfolding far to the south, Stalingrad, whose narrative of entrapment and reversal came to dominate global understanding of the Eastern Front. The less visible, less successful fighting around Rzhev, especially in late 1942, was not widely publicized. It was not forgotten by those who fought there. Veterans carried it in their memories and in the absence of those who did not return. But the broader public did not receive a full accounting. Only when archives began to open in the 1990s did researchers rebuild the sequence in detail, and even then, some files remained fragmentary. What then do we mean by the Ghost Division of Rzhev? Not a single unit with a single number, but a category of formations that effectively ceased to exist in those forests and marshes. Divisions that were dissolved in the administrative sense because they no longer had the men or the structure to fight. Their designations were struck from the lists. Sometimes they were reformed later with new personnel, carrying forward a lineage but not the same human core. For families, the ghostliness is personal. A letter stopped arriving. The date on the last postcard is November 1942. The official notification might come much later without a place of burial. The battalion commander's report may never have made it out. The battalion itself may never have made it out. The German side of the ledger confirms the scale of fighting. Ninth Army's defensive reports record the Soviet pressure and the heavy local counterattacks that followed each penetration. The Wehrmacht's defensive doctrine emphasized immediate counterthrusts to cut off spearheads. In woods fighting, that meant close-in engagements at dawn, platoons losing cohesion in fog, and brutal firefights that left a battlefield too churned and too exposed to recover all the fallen. In autumn and early winter, burial details could not dig deep enough in frozen bog. Spring thaws would bring bones back to the surface. Even in success, little moved. An observer standing on a hill near Sychevka in December 1942 would have seen the same tree lines, the same dark river fen, and heard the same patterns of fire, opening barrages in the morning, then the rising, ragged crackle of small arms as companies found each other in the woods. What changed were the people, week by week. Fresh regiments moved in. The ranks thinned. Some divisions ceased to be. Numbers are part of the story, and so is the caution with which we must handle them. For the entire Rzhev sector, across the many operations between January 1942 and March 1943, Soviet losses ran to the hundreds of thousands. The exact figures for specific phases remain debated, with historians working from incomplete archival returns, cross-checking reports from front headquarters and the central staff. German records, too, are incomplete. In the months we are discussing, late 1942, some Western scholars, drawing on newly opened files, argue that Soviet casualties were especially grievous. Others caution that some early post-Soviet figures folded together multiple overlapping offensives and rear area casualties, exaggerating the totals for the November-December operations. The direction of the evidence is clear. The cost was staggering. The precise arithmetic remains contested. The human trace is clearer. A company sergeant's diary notes that he cannot find anyone from 2nd Platoon. A battalion roll call carries a margin note, names to be verified. A political officer's report describes a trench line clogged with snow and ice. In after-action summaries, phrases recur. Communication lost. Supply did not arrive. The regiment, surrounded, fought until nightfall. Sometimes there is a line that reads simply, "Unit disbanded due to losses." In March 1943, the Germans withdrew from the salient in a planned evacuation, Operation Büffel. They flattened the towns they had held. They mined the roads and poisoned wells. They deported civilians to the west as forced labor and burned the villages behind them. When Soviet units advanced into the Rzhev ruins, they found an emptied landscape. The front line, at last, moved decisively west. This was recorded as a liberation, and it was. It was also a revelation of what 16 months of positional warfare had done to a district. Fields seeded with trap mines, forests hiding shallow graves, and an archive of pain scattered in shards across the swamps. What the opening of archives in the 1990s added to the picture was depth and sequence. Operational plans, long classified, showed how ambitious the Soviet designs had been, how carefully the staffs had attempted to choreograph artillery groups and tank brigades in bog country with few roads. Casualty returns, long held in special collections, confirmed the heavy attrition and gave shape to the disappearance of units from orders of battle. Political reports, once secret, revealed the stress under which formations operated. Men fighting with frost-bitten feet. Junior officers promoted on the line into command of companies and battalions because their seniors were on. And the constant grinding pressure of attacking fixed positions under observation. Those same files also illuminated how the Red Army learned. The failures of late 1942 had many causes: terrain, weather, German defenses, coordination problems, but they were not ignored. In the winter of 1942 to 43 and into 1944, the Soviets adapted their approach to combined arms in forests and marshes. Artillery preparation became more sophisticated. Engineers were used more systematically for road building and bridging. Operational deception improved, and the synchronization of tank and infantry tactics in wooded and broken terrain evolved. That learning, purchased at places like Rzhev, would matter later when Soviet armies had to break through mixed forest, swamp, and river barriers on their way to the pre-war borders and beyond. Yet learning does not fill in every blank. Consider the families who wrote to district offices after 1945 asking for information about a son or husband reported missing near Rzhev. The district officer would sift through files, some complete, some torn, some missing entirely. If a body had not been recovered and identified, the answer might be a set of coordinates for an approximate place of disappearance. If the unit had been disbanded, the paperwork might reference a date with no detail about the circumstances. For decades, veterans groups and local historians walked those woods and compiled lists of names found on identity tags recovered from shallow graves. These civic acts slowly gave faces back to those who had become, in the state's ledgers, a line on a return or a missing page. In this sense, the ghost division is not just an administrative reality, but a social one. an absence in thousands of kitchens, a portrait on a wall, a chair that stayed empty. Its disappearance was made possible by the terrain and the tempo of the fighting, and then reinforced by the wartime need for secrecy and the post-war habit of silence. When the archive boxes finally opened more fully, the paper became an echo of people, and the gaps in the paper became a map of places where soldiers had been and never returned from. There is another dimension, confident and emotionally grounded. The voice should sound like a professional documentary narrator, authoritative but human, cinematic yet educational. Speak with quiet intensity, using natural pauses after key phrases for dramatic effect. Tempo, moderate pace, deliberate and steady, allowing each historical detail to resonate. Clarity, highly articulate and precise. Pronounce every word clearly, with subtle emphasis on names, dates, and numbers. Slightly vary the pitch and rhythm to keep the narration engaging and natural. Mood variation. Lower tone and slower pace during tense or tragic moments. Softer and reflective during emotional parts. Steady and confident during technical or factual explanations. There is another dimension to this story: the commanders who carried the weight of these operations. Their names, front commanders, army commanders, chiefs of staff, appear throughout the documents. They wrote orders that demanded impossible things. Capture the following line by 0800. Maintain contact with adjacent units. Commit reserves at the decisive sector. Some later rose to prominence, their reputations built on victories elsewhere. The record shows their plans at Rzhev, and the results on those wet, dark forest floors. It is not a story of villains and heroes, but of a war fought at the very edge of logistical and human endurance. The commanders' signatures share the page with casualty returns that show what reality did to those plans when they met the bog. Every few paragraphs of any honest account of Rzhev should return to the ground, because the ground is what determined so much. Imagine a rifleman moving at night, following a compass bearing, waist deep in a marsh channel, his rifle above his head. He reaches the far bank and collapses into stunted pine. The company forms slowly, men shaking with cold, each breath a plume in the dark. Dawn comes gray and without a sun. The order is to advance. They stand and are seen. Machine gun fire cuts the air. The forward squads disappear into a low fold of ground that turns out to be water under snow. For the men behind, their comrades are simply gone. Every few paragraphs of any honest account of Rzhev should return to the ground, because the ground is what determined so much. Imagine a rifleman moving at night, following a compass bearing, waist deep in a marsh channel, his rifle above his head. He reaches the far bank and collapses into stunted pine. The company forms slowly, men shaking with cold, each breath a plume in the dark. Dawn comes gray and without a sun. The order is to advance. They stand and are seen. Machine gun fire cuts the air. The forward squads disappear into a low fold of ground that turns out to be water under snow. For the men behind, their comrades are simply gone. After the war, memorials took shape in Rzhev's district. stone, bronze, and markers in clearing after clearing. The symbolic language is one of endurance and mourning. Beneath those symbols are the particulars, names, service numbers, dates that researchers now labor to complete. The work continues because the record is still incomplete. Each new name found and each unit diary page recovered gives definition to what, for too long, was blurred. Several truths can be held together at once. The Rzhev battles were militarily consequential. They pinned and bled a major German force close to Moscow, and, by early 1943, contributed to the shifting balance on the Central Front. They were humanly catastrophic. Entire formations endured months of attrition, culminating in erasure. Their story is complicated. Some operational records conflict. Casualty figures are still debated, and wartime propaganda on both sides obscured details. And their memory is necessary. Without Rzhev, the shape of the war's middle years is distorted. We cannot resurrect the exact roll calls of every division that disappeared there. We can reconstruct the outlines and, within those outlines, honor the individuals whose lives unfolded along those front lines. The runner with the message tube. The telephone operator is laying wire along a frozen ditch. The staff clerk made 2 carbon copies of a daily return and watched one burn when a shell landed. The artilleryman who learned to read the marsh not just by map contour, but by smell and by the way the wind combed the sedge. The end, the Rzhev salient, vanished, not in a clean victory, but in a calculated German withdrawal under pressure. The front line moved, and attention shifted as the Red Army surged west in 1943 and 1944. But the soldiers of those lost formations did not move with it. For them, the war ended in that patchwork of forest and bog. Their traces lay beneath the snow, and their paperwork lay behind closed doors for half a century. Today, when we leaf through the documents that have emerged from those archives, the ghost divisions of Rzhev take on shape again. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to sense their presence. Orders and returns place them where they stood. Fragmentary rosters give names back to the battalions. Contested numbers remind us to be careful. Unmarked graves remind us to be humble. The historian's task is to hold these things together: the operational frame, the administrative language that hid so much in plain sight, and the human reality that saturates every line. The ground at Rzhev teaches the rest. On that ground are the reasons units vanished. In that ground is the explanation for why their records are jagged and incomplete. In that ground, if you stand quietly in winter, you can hear the war's strange acoustics. How a machine gun crackles differently over water. How an order sounds when whispered through a scarf. How silence after artillery lands is not silence at all, but men deciding whether to stand and move again. The ghost army of Rzhev did not vanish into myth. It vanished into history, which is made of paper and earth. We have more of the paper now. The earth still keeps the rest.